Hello everybody. Our lecture today is about communicative language teaching CLT. This topic is especially important for you because communicative language teaching is the approach which is used for or in teaching English as a foreign language in Iraq. So you will use this approach to teach English in the future by God's will. That's why I want you to pay special attention to communicative language teaching. Communicative language teaching (CLT) began in Britain in 1960s. This was in response to Chomsky's criticism of structural theories of language. We talked about Chomsky's criticism in our previous lecture. We mentioned that Chomsky says or argues that language acquisition is not imitation or repetition, but it is the innovation of new utterances according to the abstract rules in the speaker's mind. And in this case, Chomsky introduced two important terms, competence and performance. CLT is not a method, it is an approach. It is very important to understand this idea that communicative language teaching is an approach. This approach is supported by many different theoretical principles provided by different scholars. In this approach, students are given tasks to accomplish using language instead of studying the language or learning about the language. The students are supposed to do different language games, communication tasks, role plays in order to be given the opportunity to use the language to communicate with each other and with the teacher. CLT is an approach that seeks to overcome the limitation of the audiolingual method. Students were often found to be unable to transfer skills acquired through audiolingualism to real communication outside the classroom. So, we cannot achieve this according to the audiolingual method. That's why we have the introduction of communicative language teaching. The focus on meaningful communication, not on structural points as it is in the audiolingual method. The actual language use is emphasized over the grammatically correct language usage. So, the ability to use language is emphasized more than the knowledge of grammatical structures and pronunciation of the target language. A very important feature of communicative language teaching, or CLT, that it is a student-centered approach. For students accomplish their tasks in cooperation and interaction with other students while the teacher plays the role of an observer and advisor. In this approach, the student is the center of all the activities. It is the student who is supposed to communicate, to do the tasks, to do most of the activities, to interact with other students and with the teacher. From this, we understand that the teacher has a less dominant role than in teacher-centered approaches. And the teacher plays different roles in CLT, but the most important one is the teacher's role as communication facilitator to help the students to communicate with each other and with the teacher. We mentioned that the communicative approach is supported by many different theoretical principles. Now I'm going to explain the major linguistic theories supporting the communicative approach. Number one, Halliday's functional account of language. He introduced the macrofunctions and microfunctions performed through language. Halliday believes that language is a tool that we use to perform a set of functions. We perform different functions through our use of language macrofunctions and microfunctions. Functions of language include activities such as inviting, introducing, complaining, suggesting, arguing, summarizing, and so on. The second important contribution is Wilkins' functional notional view of language, in which he introduced a communicative definition of language, which served later on as the basis for developing communicative syllabuses. Wilkins introduced linguistic notions, and he mentioned that linguistic notions are used to perform functions such as inviting, complaining, requesting, and so on. Another important work is the work of Henry Woodson. Henry Woodson's view of language for communication. He mentioned that we can learn language through using it. Students learn when they apply their knowledge of language for communication. And he distinguished between use and usage. He mentioned that language use is concerned with the ability to use language appropriately or the appropriacy of what the learners say and social acceptability, while usage refers to the grammaticality of sentences produced by learners. Usage is about what to say. Use is about how it should be said in order to be socially appropriate. So it is very important to distinguish between these two terms because in communicative language teaching, the most important idea is language use. Then we come to the work of Durkheim's theory of communicative competence. Durkheim mentioned that Chomsky's view of language is very limited. That he is talking about Chomsky's linguistic competence. He says that Chomsky's linguistic competence is very limited because it does not account for the social nature of language. It is far from the realities of language use. It only characterizes part of man's ability in using language. So, from now on, we need to distinguish between linguistic competence and communicative competence. Linguistic competence is introduced by Chomsky, it refers to the speaker's ability to produce an infinite number of grammatically correct sentences according to the abstract rules in the speaker's mind. While communicative competence refers to what the speaker needs in order to be communicatively competent. So, Himes rejected Chomsky's linguistic competence because it is very limited and it does not account for the social aspects of language. According to Himes, and part of his introduction of communicative competence, he mentioned that learners must know whether and to what extent their utterances are, number one, formally passable, which means linguistically correct, feasible, which means not stylistically awkward, 3, appropriate, which means appropriate to the context in which language is produced, and finally performed, which means actually used in real contexts. So these are the 4 aspects of communicative competence introduced by Delheims. According to Delheims, language ability or communicative competence is not only the knowledge of what to say, but also the knowledge of how to say it, to whom, why, when, and with what effects. So speakers or language learners need to keep in mind all these aspects when they are learning language. Finally, we have the contribution of Cannell and Swain. Cannell and Swain have worked on the development of the four dimensions of Himes' communicative competence into four types of competence. Number one, grammatical competence. Number two, sociolinguistic competence. Three, discourse competence. And four, strategic competence. First, we start with grammatical competence, which refers to the knowledge of language usage, the knowledge of vocabulary, grammar rules, and meanings. Grammatical competence is the same the same idea with Chomsky's linguistic competence. So, Chomsky's linguistic competence represents only one part of communicative competence, which is knowledge of grammatical structures, vocabulary, grammar rules, and meanings. The second aspect which should be available in the language used by language learners is sociolinguistic competence, knowledge of social conventions. It is the knowledge of how people in different societies communicate. Discourse competence refers to knowledge of text and context. It enables speakers to understand that words and sentences can have different meanings in different linguistic contexts. In addition to this, in discourse, we refer to the idea of text, the text is the language which consists of more than one sentence. In this case, when we produce language consisting of more than one sentence, our language should be connected according to grammar and according to meaning. That's why in discourse competence we refer to cohesion, which refers to grammatical connection, and coherence, which refers to meaning connection of the language produced by speakers. Finally, we have strategic competence. It enables the speakers of the language to bridge the gap between what they want to say and their linguistic repertoire of knowledge. It enables the speakers to initiate, to maintain, and to terminate communicative interactions successfully. That is, the ability to produce or to communicate in a meaningful way despite the lack of information. And sometimes language learners have certain gaps. They don't know a particular vocabulary item or a particular grammatical structure, so they try to use different strategies that enables them to start a conversation, to maintain the conversation, and end this conversation successfully and in a meaningful way. Thank you very much. That's all for our lecture today. What I want you to do is that you should go to the experience of communicative language teaching. I want you to read it. You have the text, because this will make our coming lecture easier, so that I'll start directly with explaining the most important aspects of the experience of communicative language teaching. Thank you very much.